Welcome to the Unlucky Sperm Club podcast. My name is Nelson Tressler. I'm the author of the Unlucky Sperm Club. And this is our first podcast, and it is entitled Just Get Started. I think it's very appropriately titled because we have been trying to get this podcast off the ground for over 6 months now. And as some of you guys can attest, probably most of you guys can attest, whenever you're trying to get something off the ground or get started on something, there's always 100 things that prevent you from doing it. And that was what it was like with this podcast. And finally, I'm just told myself, you know what, I'm just going to get started and get this podcast off the ground. It's been over 6 months since we've started the process of getting this podcast started. And we've gone around and around from everything from we needed to order a new microphone because the microphone we were using had horrible sound. And then when we got the sound right, we needed to have a better camera. And then when we needed a better camera, we needed to have a better background in the room for video. And it went one thing after another that kept preventing us from feeling like we were ready to just start the podcast and get it out there. And what we want to do is we want to be able to interview guests. And we don't have any guests today, but we're just getting started. We're still waiting for Tony Robbins and Oprah Winfrey to call us to be guests on our podcast, but we're not going to wait to start the podcast until that happens. So this podcast is titled Just Get Started, and those are the things that I want to talk about today. I want to talk about the things that hold us back from just getting started. And I've done some research and some personal experience, and I just want to go through these key points and relate those back to you. And I'm sure those things will be going off in your mind, the bells and the whistles about why you haven't started a particular project and probably why you're still haven't started that project. The number one thing that I found on why we don't just start things and get going is we don't feel like it. We rely way too much on our feelings. I mean, who really feels like waking up at 5 a.m. in the morning and starting to work out? Who feels like doing those 10 extra sales calls? Who feels like being super sweet to your spouse after they've offended you, or calling that friend up to have that hard conversation about what's going wrong in that relationship? I mean, we rely way too much on our feelings. And the one thing that I've realized in success is after you quit relying on your feelings. It's not doing what you feel like you're doing. When you become successful, it is when you do the things that you don't feel like doing. That's who becomes successful. When we stop because we don't feel like doing it or it's uncomfortable, those are the people that stay in that comfort zone. And unfortunately, there is not much success or growth in that comfort zone. So the number one thing to do just to get started is to quit relying on your feelings and to go ahead and just get started and do what you know you need to do. The number two thing that prevents many of us from getting started is the excuse factory. It is amazing that when you have something that needs to get done, the brain starts that excuse factory. And there is no factory on earth that can match the production of the excuse factory in our brains when we have something that we need to get done. The excuses come flying out left and right. There are all kinds of things that come to mind, like, oh, I can't do it today. For whatever reason, whatever excuse pops out. And it's not just one excuse. There's usually 10 or 12 excuses that will come out. And those excuses, typically, they don't go away. Even when you fix 5 of the excuses, you realize, oh, there's another excuse. That our brain is so good at that excuse factory. It wants to keep us comfortable. It wants to keep us in that safe zone where our brain knows that we're safe and we're comfortable and we're not hurt. And in order to do that, it pumps up that excuse factory, and it pumps out all the excuses why we shouldn't do it, why we shouldn't get started. So we've got to be very conscious of that excuse factory and be able to overcome that excuse factory. Another reason that we never get started is we're looking for perfection. We want things to be perfect. And until we can think in our minds that they're going to be perfect, we won't get started. What we need to do is take a step back and say, you know what? We don't need perfection. What we need is progress. We need to take one additional step closer to our goal, closer to where we want to end up. When we set and wait for perfection, that's all we get done doing is just waiting. So don't wait for perfection. Think progress. And when we think progress, when we realize that we're not going to be perfect today, but we're going to be a little bit better. And as we get a little bit better each day, even if we just get 1% better each day in 100 days, we're going to be pretty close to being good, as opposed to just waiting until we're 100% perfect. It never happens. So don't think perfection, think progress. One of the reasons a lot of people stop and don't get started is that they don't have a long-term perspective. They're thinking short-term. They're thinking in the here and the now. They're thinking that what they're going to start is not going to get them the things that they need. When we think short-term, we're thinking about the here and now. And many of the things that we procrastinate on and that we don't get started on are things that don't necessarily help us in the here and now. They're going to help us a week, a month, a year, 5 years from now. And when we bring on that long-term perspective and we realize, you know what, the benefits from doing this and starting this and just getting started are probably not going to benefit me very much today in the here and now. But when I can take a step back and know, you know what, I need to start this podcast. I need to get it going because I know the lives that it's going to change. Maybe not today, maybe not even next month or next year, but eventually when I can look at that long term, then that gives me the determination to go ahead and get started and know that eventually what I'm going to do is going to pay off. The next thing that distracts a lot of us from finally getting started and just doing it is what I like to call the busy bee syndrome. There's always 1,000 things for us to do, especially whenever there's something that we know we need to do, but we don't necessarily want to do it. That busy bee syndrome pops up, and there's always those 100 things that we've actually put off, but all of a sudden they're easier to do than what we know we need to do. So we're going to go ahead and do all those things. And we can fill up the day with all these little insignificant things that, you know what, they probably have to be done, but they're not going to make that big of a difference in, you know, what we really need to do. But we'll fill the day up doing these busy bee things. And you know what? At the end of the day, we probably feel pretty good because we've been busy all day. But when we take a step back and we look at what we have accomplished and what difference that's going to mean on our goals, chances are it's not going to make that big of a difference. We just kind of filled up the day so we would feel better about ourselves. And we're still putting off that thing that's going to make the biggest difference. So we've got to get away from that busy bee syndrome and make sure that we don't get caught up in being busy for the sake of being busy. One of the things that I've really struggled with is focusing when we have to do that thing that we have to do. we focus on the wrong things. We're focusing on the pain. We're focusing on the fear. We're even focusing on the what ifs. We start to focus on all the things that could go wrong, the reasons that we don't want to do it. That will prevent us from finally just taking that step and doing what we need to do. If we focus on the good things, for example, this podcast, I'm hoping that somebody watches this podcast, and from the things that I'm talking about today, that they're finally going to do that one thing that they've been putting off for maybe a month, maybe a year, maybe 5 years. And they're going to use some of these strategies and techniques to finally just get started. And in a year, they're going to be so much further along. They're going to accomplish that goal because of this. That's what I'm focusing on right now. And that has motivated me to finally come in here and just get this podcast started and to get it out there, because I know that these strategies and these techniques are going to help somebody else finally just get started on what they need to get started on. Another thing that prevents a lot of people from finally getting started is that they already have so many things to do. I mean, if you're going throughout your life, chances are you're already busy, and this kind of goes along with the busy bee syndrome. There's always something to do. There's never a time where we're just sitting around twiddling our thumbs and our to-do list is finally 100% complete. That almost never happens. There's always something else to do. And if we focus on all those things that we already have to do, it's going to be very hard for us to finally just start the thing that we need to start. I like to prioritize things, and things on my to-do list that aren't going to make a big difference in my life. We've got to put those things that are going to make a big difference at the top of our to-do list. And what you'll realize is some of those things that absolutely are on our to-do list and need to be done, when we start doing those high value to-dos that are making a big difference, those low to-dos typically either fall off of our list or somehow they get done through osmosis. So focus on those things that are going to make the biggest difference. We're always going to be busy. We just need to learn to prioritize. I think one of the things that prevents people from finally getting started on the things that they need to get started on is they don't have a strong enough why. And I know so many people have talked about this concept of having that strong why, being obsessed with what you need to do. Unfortunately, it's so true. We have to have that strong why. We have to know why we're doing something. If we don't have that strong why, we're going to fail. If we're not obsessed with what we have to do, we're going to let things fall by the wayside and we'll fail at getting those things done. So we need to make sure that we're crystal clear on why we want to do something and understand why we have that strong why we're obsessed with accomplishing the goal that we need to accomplish. That will help us finally just get started. One of the things that I struggle with is the shiny object syndrome. And I like to call this the neon brain. One of the things that we talk about in the IGotSmarter program is that we have 3 brains that pretty much make up our one brain. We have our old brain that's doing all the manual tasks, keeping us safe, keeping us comfortable. And then we have our neon brain. And our neon section of our brain is that part of our brain that goes after all those shiny objects. It's always looking for something new, something better, something more exciting. And the problem is we need to get to the enriched part of our brain, which is the part of our brain where we grow and we learn. The problem is that our old brain and our neon brain take up about 99% of our brain capacity, and we struggle to get to that enriched part of our brain. And we are bouncing from new shiny object to new shiny object. And when we do that, we never follow through with the things that we need to in order to get started. So we need to be very aware of what part of our brain is driving us. And getting distracted by the next shiny object is not going to help us achieve our goals. And it absolutely will not help us to get started on the things that we know we need to do. One of the things that I think we all fall into the trap of, and Brian Tracy, I give Brian Tracy credit for this, is in his book, he talks about someday I'll do this, or someday I'll do that. And that's pretty much where we leave it, because you know what? Someday never comes. We are always placing those things that we need to do, our goals, our dreams, our aspirations, and we say someday we're doing that. And what happens is all of our dreams, all of our goals go to this magical place that Brian Tracy calls it someday I'll. And it's an island where all our dreams go to die because we never get around to doing them. So we need to make sure that we're not parking our dreams, parking our goals on this island of someday I'll. Now, I'm sitting here and I'm doing this podcast, and I know it's not very polished. I know it's not very professional, but I did just get started. I started a podcast. I finally quit looking at all those things and all the reasons that I couldn't do it. And I picked that one reason to just get started. And I hope that this podcast helps others out there finally just get started. Things don't need to be perfect. Just make progress. And I'm grateful for you listening. And this is the start of the podcast. And now the next step for me is to continue on and to continue with my goals and continue with this podcast, continue to try to help people achieve their goals and to live the life that they're capable of living. Again, my name is Nelson Tressler. I am the author of the Unlucky Sperm Club, and this is the Unlucky Sperm Club podcast. Thank you for listening.